conferences and what they call harmony agreements between the two sides of the peace movement that more or less made peace, at least among the ordinary people, if not their leaders. You had the women's movement, which now had the right to vote and needed something else to do, take on a huge leading role in lobbying senators and Congress for peace. A woman named Carrie Chapman Catt became really a leader of this effort and suffered a heart attack during the final days of lobbying every senator for this thing in January of '29. You had a movement that organized internationally, that hired staff internationally, that lobbied in every country and in every newspaper. You had a movement that kept its arguments very closely to the morality of the issue. There was not as much focus as you might see today on financial costs of war or the costs to the lives we really care about, those of Americans. There was a strong focus on the immorality of war. There was a lot of passion in this movement, and it was largely about education. There was a lot of educating. There was endless articles, journals, pamphlets, brochures, posters, books, what we would call teach-ins. There were countless conferences and resolutions passed and public speaking tours, and there was a very long-term vision. These were people who thought that they were engaged in something like the abolition of slavery that was going to take decades. They were engaged in abolishing something that had been around for centuries, and they would need to slowly change the entire culture to do it. And so they avoided getting behind particular personalities. I've talked to people comparing Senator Borah with Congressman Ron Paul, and the biggest difference is, there's lots of huge differences between those two men, but the biggest difference is there weren't any people who identified themselves as Borahists, the way there are self-identified Ron Paulers. There was no, on any side of the peace movement, either part of it, there was no identification with an individual or a party or a candidate or a president. The Progressive Party and the Socialist Party were huge factors in pushing this agenda, but both the Democratic and Republican parties eventually got on board. The entire nation had to get on board. There was also none of this inversion of the representative process that we see today, where a labor union like AFSCME that's been for single-payer health coverage for years and years holds a rally here in Charlottesville where you're forbidden to bring a poster that says single-payer health coverage because they went and asked the people in Washington that they're supposedly pressuring what they should pressure them to do, and then came and told us what we wanted to want. There was none of this reversal of how it's supposed to work. Instead, there was an uncensored, passionate demand to eliminate war and be done with it. There was a decade of failures. There was disarmament conferences that resulted in more armaments. There was a League of Nations defeat in the Senate, the World Court defeat in the Senate. There was constant setbacks, and nobody seemed to pause. The movement just seemed to grow and grow as the education about what World War I had been made further inroads into the entire population. I see a lot in the way this movement was done that we could learn from. And there were stronger demands that made eliminating all war seem more mainstream. Right? There were demands to disarm. There were demands to get out of Nicaragua, to stop threatening Mexico, to do away with the Monroe Doctrine and all possibility of imperialism. There was a strong demand that almost got on the books in the 30s to require a public referendum before you could start a war. Right? There was all variety of, there were competitions in the 1920s for peace proposals that had tens of thousands of entries. right? You know, including entries by people like Franklin Roosevelt. You know, all of the diplomats and politicians and would-be politicians and professional peace activists and ordinary people in this country and other countries were entering these contests with peace proposals. There was every sort of push in this direction. And passing a treaty to eliminate war, to renounce war and say henceforth we will only use pacific means to resolve our disputes, actually became mainstream. And so this technique of preemptively self-censoring, don't put single payer on the poster, was not the way they went. And they did pretty well. So in the end, you had a senator from Kansas, Arthur Capper, who really brought the power of all the farmers with him, pushing a resolution in the Senate for a treaty that would ban aggressive war. And you had the French wanting to ban aggressive war. And you had the French and the Americans wanting you know, a treaty just between the Americans and the French, and to ban wars that are aggressive. And you had Senator Borah, who wanted to be president, wanted to be in charge, wanted to have the outlawist or isolationist side carry the day, pushed for a universal treaty and a treaty to ban all war. Good, bad, whatever, all war. And so, in the end, in order to not do nothing, which was impossible given the public pressure, and in order to not ban aggressive war, they banned all war. You had in 1928 various attempts to avoid it from the bureaucrats in D.C. and in Paris. You had the State Department bureaucrats wanting to put the language into a preamble of a treaty. The preambles typically in treaties being things that please the public, but the diplomats have got their fingers crossed behind their backs, and they're considering the preambles non-binding, and just the part, this is the part where it says whereas, and then just the lower part of the treaty to actually be binding. They wanted to play that kind of a stunt. And the French were happy to just drop the whole thing. They made lots of good news talking about it. They didn't really want to do it internationally. They didn't want, you know, a treaty with Germany or the communists. You know, the United States had never, you know, done anything with Russia since World War I, had not acknowledged its existence, right? So the reason that in the end this didn't die, other than the public pressure that was going to keep coming back, was that by this point Frank Kellogg, the Secretary of State, the Republican from Minnesota, the lawyer who had done trust busting and who cursed pacifists and never understood outlawry to the day he died, wanted a Nobel Peace Prize. And he worked night and day to organize the nations of the world behind this treaty. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize. And he's buried in the National Cathedral, and there's a whole window and section of the cathedral dedicated to him and his work for peace. And it's a credit to him that he answered the demand of his culture, and that they were giving out Nobel Peace Prizes for actual peace work, unlike some other periods in history. And so by January 1929, you had the Senate overwhelmingly support the thing. You had senators who gave strong arguments against it vote yes for it, and explain their votes by saying they didn't want to be lynched when they got back home to their states. The one senator who voted no was censured by his state legislature, and this was on the books by 1929, by which point there was a brand new doctrine that gains made through war would not be recognized. Russia made moves to go into China and was universally reprimanded, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact was pointed out to them, and they called it off. And a couple years later, same routine with Japan. There were wars prevented for a historical moment. And then wars came back. Much more was done in the 20s and the 30s and the early 40s to cause wars than to prevent them. This was a step in the right direction. The body of law was never created. The world court was never created. It was a first step. And yet, when World War II was coming to a close, and Franklin Roosevelt, who had mocked the Kellogg-Briand Pact and was happy to violate it years before, was looking for a way to prosecute Nazi crimes and Japanese crimes. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact had essentially been forgotten. And there was a lawyer in New York who made the case to Roosevelt against the opinion of all the bureaucrats and all the law professors that the Kellogg-Briand Pact would allow prosecution of the crime of making war, and then every other act involved in that effort would itself be a crime under the laws of the nations involved. And Franklin Roosevelt wrote a little note saying, here's the way we've got to go, and lo and behold, all the bureaucrats said, there really is a strong legal argument here. And so laws are what we make of them. And ironically and perversely enough, the trials at Nuremberg invented out of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which had been created to avoid outlawing aggressive war, the crime of aggressive war. And Nazis were prosecuted for aggressive war. And this included Nazi diplomats who had threatened war and nations had surrendered. It included industrialists. It included leading Nazis and Japanese were prosecuted for the crime of making war. At the end of World War I, gains made through war were legal gains, and there was no such crime as making war. There were only the crimes of particular atrocities. And so every war since, you've had to claim to be acting in defense, which Levinson and the outlawists in the 20s understood was a universal claim. Every war, everybody was always happy to claim defense. We've, in the past decade, gone and attacked impoverished, unarmed nations halfway around the globe and called it defense. And so there's a weakness. The Kellogg-Briand Pact also was a predecessor for the UN Charter, but it's much stronger than the UN Charter. The UN Charter says you can't have war unless it's defensive or unless the UN okays it, right? And so we now have the International Criminal Court promising to prosecute war makers beginning in 2017, but they must be makers of aggressive war, and they cannot be makers of wars authorized by the United Nations, and the prosecutions cannot be disfavored by the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So this International Criminal Court looks as weak as a servant of the UN as the World Court in the 20s looked as a servant of the League of Nations to someone coming from a perspective of wanting to outlaw war. So we have a huge way to go. We have a cause that was advanced, a huge step in the 1920s. And I think at this point, it's our turn to pick it up and carry it forward. And it's very encouraging to me that we're in a moment now when we finally have people in the streets and in the parks and in the squares, independently of candidates and politicians and parties, demanding, in many cases, end to wars, end to massive military spending, as well as an end to this economic inequality and concentration of wealth, a huge part of which is accomplished through the war machine. It's starting to look like a popular movement. Tomorrow is a huge day of pushback against Mr. Bloomberg and the rest of these criminals. And on Monday, if you haven't gotten the announcement, everybody should show up at Lee Park in Charlottesville at 5 o'clock and wear red. They've chosen the color red. And everyone is going to go down to City Council and get on the list to speak for 3 minutes each and occupy that entire meeting and express our concerns for our First Amendment rights. And I think, I've talked to people who say, you know, they're pushing back against us, we must be doing something wrong. We tried this nonviolent stuff, but now the police have chosen to use violence, so there we go. You know, this is exactly wrong, right? This is a moment to be very, very much encouraged. The purpose of a nonviolent campaign is not to prevent the police from using violence against you. It's to change your society. And of course you expect the police to use violence against you if you begin to have any success. So that's to be encouragement. Now is when the nonviolent determination kicks in. Now is when you need a nonviolent movement. Up until now, it's just been a movement. And so I'm very, very much encouraged that something is starting, and I hope we can draw some lessons from the past. And thank you for coming out here tonight.